Thank you everyone for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format enables the Budget Committee to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. As always, I want to acknowledge our privilege of being able to be part of the conversations that we have here in this committee, and ask everyone to always keep in mind throughout our deliberations and discussions that sometimes the people affected most by our decisions are people who are unable to join us in the room, and to always act accordingly. Tonight, we will be hearing a financial condition update from city staff, followed by an update on the budget process, and then we'll have some committee business. So I'm ready to hand things over to the city manager for that presentation on the financial condition.
Thank you, Ty. It's really great to be back here with you, and always good to be able to share information. Maurizio does a great job of kind of walking through how we forecast and what we've done over the years. So I'm looking forward to his presentation. I think it'll be a good reminder of some of the challenges we still have ahead. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Maurizio.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Give me a moment to get my screen share set up. Okay, hopefully you see the first slide there. So let's get into it. So good evening. My name is Maurizio Bottalico. I'm a senior financial analyst in the finance division. And tonight I'll be providing you with a financial condition update. So the budget for the city and the Urban Renewal Agency is organized into 35 reporting funds, which fit into the categories shown here. The fund types in the white boxes represent funds used to account for revenue sources that are legally restricted for specific purposes, or to account for operations funded by users of the service through fees and charges. Generally, when we talk about the forecast or the financial condition of the city, we are referring to the general fund. The general fund is used to account for all other financial resources not required to be accounted for in one of these other funds. So this graphic represents the city's adopted budget for the current fiscal year. You can see the general fund represents about 1/4 of the city's total budget. The general fund is the largest of all city funds and consists of the main subfund, the Cultural Services Subfund, and the Equipment Replacement Subfund. Tonight, when I refer to the general fund, I am talking about the main subfund, which represents the true discretionary resources of the organization. The general fund forecast is a tool that projects how much the city will spend and receive over the next 6 years, which assists policymakers in developing strategies to meet future challenges. Finance staff regularly monitor and track many variables for the forecast, which are shown at a high level here. The city has been utilizing the forecast for many years to help guide us through difficult financial times, including the Great Recession. While the data used in the forecast is updated regularly, the data sources and methodologies have remained relatively consistent over time. So in addition to the city's financial data, the forecast utilizes many data sources to inform our revenue and expense projections. I'll provide a brief overview of some of the key data sources here. City of Eugene certified population data comes from Portland State University, and future population projections are based on state-provided growth estimates. Lane County Assessment and Taxation provides much of the data used to estimate property tax revenue. We also analyze the city's building permit data to project taxable construction activity. eWeb provides us with an updated SILT forecast twice per year. eWeb's forecast includes known electric rate increases and estimated consumption patterns, which are largely driven by the weather. The League of Oregon Cities publishes an annual report that informs our projections of state revenue sharing, which includes state tax revenue from the sale of alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana. The Oregon Office of Economic Analysis releases projected CPI inflation data 4 times per year, and this is used as the general inflation rate in the forecast. Compensation adjustments for represented employees are defined in union contracts, and compensation adjustments for non-represented employees are determined by the city's executive team. Employer-specific PERS rates, which are updated every other year, are recommended by the PERS actuary and approved by the PERS board. The actuary also publishes advisory rates in the years between rate setting, and PERS provides a rate projection tool to help employers estimate future rates. Health and risk rates are recommended by the city's Employee Resource Center and include actuarial projections. And rounding out the list, the investment portfolio earnings rate is determined by the city's Investment Advisory Board and is used to estimate interest earnings on cash balances. There are many variables impacting the forecast that can trend upward or downward. This is intended to be a high-level overview of where we are today, and a more in-depth forecast review will happen in April at the city manager's FY23 proposed budget presentation. The current forecast includes the approved FY22 supplemental budget actions that were reviewed at the December Budget Committee meeting. The forecast also incorporates other updates to major drivers that have changed since the adopted budget forecast. I'll highlight a few of the key changes here. So let's start on the revenue side. Property taxes are the largest revenue source in the general fund. We have updated our property tax projections based on current data and updated information from the Lane County tax assessor. The good news is that the pandemic did not have as much impact on property tax revenue as the tax assessor was initially predicting, so we have increased our future projections. Contributions in lieu of taxes, or SILT, from eWeb is the second largest revenue source in the general fund. We've updated our forecast to align with eWeb's current projections, which include electric price increases over the next few years and higher weather-adjusted loads due to improving economic conditions. This results in higher projected SILT revenue in the future. It's important to keep in mind that the weather plays a key role in SILT revenue. Warmer winter weather over the last few years has put downward pressure on SILT revenue, but this year has been better. Recent SILT payments for December and January, the coldest months of the year, were on par with eWeb's projections. Service charges represent the third largest revenue source in the general fund. This category includes revenue from various services such as swimming pools and other recreation facilities, the spay and neuter clinic, and police and fire services, among others. Projected future revenue has increased as we expand services at renovated facilities and pandemic restrictions are lifted. Unfortunately, the future revenue increases in property taxes, SILT, and service charges are outweighed by the loss of Comcast right-of-way revenue from internet services. You may recall from last spring that we lost a court case related to this issue, but at the time, it was not clear when Comcast would stop paying. We were notified by Comcast in the fall that they would cease remitting payments after the first quarter of FY22. This results in an estimated revenue loss of $2.4 million in FY22, and then $3.2 million per year ongoing starting in FY23. So now moving on to the expense side. Personnel costs represent the largest expense in the general fund. Ongoing worker shortages have put upward pressure on wages, impacting employers across the country. Since the previous forecast, new contracts have been ratified for our 2 fire unions and also for the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, or AFSCME for short. These new contracts have led to higher personnel costs in the current forecast compared to projections from the previous forecast. Another factor contributing to increased personnel costs is that we are expecting another significant PERS rate increase in FY24, which we'll discuss in more detail later. And as you have likely heard about on the news, ongoing supply chain issues have caused higher inflation than we have seen in recent memory. We budget and forecast inflation based on projections provided by the state economist, and we'll take a closer look at those projections on a later slide. Property taxes, SILT, and service charges are the top 3 revenue types in the general fund. These 3 revenue types account for almost 80% of general fund revenues, with property taxes representing the largest share by far at 66%. On the last slide, we talked about these revenue types and how future projections have increased compared to the previous forecast. But let's look at what happened over the last few years. The table on the right shows actual average annual growth of these revenue types over the last 3 full fiscal years. The good news is that property tax revenue growth has remained positive throughout the pandemic. However, the growth rate is limited to approximately 4%, and we'll take a deeper dive into this topic on the next slide. Silt revenue is driven by the price of electricity and how much is consumed. EWEB did not have any electric price increases during this time, combined with warmer winter weather and pandemic impacts, resulting in negative silt revenue growth for the city. Negative growth in service charges during this period can be largely attributed to pandemic-related closures and restrictions. It's worth noting that, unlike property taxes or silt, where we have little or no control over the amount of revenue we receive, we can influence this revenue category through the fees we charge for city services. Of course, we must also consider accessibility and affordability across all income levels. And at the bottom row of this table shows that the average growth rate across all revenue types in the general fund over the last 3 years was just 3%. Please note this does not include the first tranche of ARPA funds that we received at the end of FY21. So let's look at why growth in general fund property tax revenue is limited to approximately 4% per year based on the current design of Oregon's property tax system and typical construction activity here in Eugene. Property tax revenue is determined by the amount of taxable assessed property value, the tax rate, and the collection rate. Given that the general fund permanent tax rate is frozen and the collection rate stays relatively consistent over time, increases in property tax revenue are largely attributed to increases in assessed value, which are constitutionally limited to just 3% per year for existing properties. The only way to exceed 3% growth is through new construction of taxable property, with the key word being taxable. New projects like Hayward Field and the Knight Campus are great for the community, but unfortunately do not contribute to the city's property tax base. The chart on the left shows statewide real market value and assessed value trends going all the way back to 1990. The solid blue line represents real market value, and the dashed orange line represents assessed value. You can see the lower assessed value begins in 1997 after passage of Measure 50. Oregon's property tax system provides relatively consistent assessed value growth. Assessed value does not spike during housing booms, but it also doesn't nosedive during housing busts either. The downside to this is that our property tax revenue does not benefit from the current real estate market, which is experiencing fast rising property values. The current market trend is captured in the blue line, but our property tax revenue is limited by the lower orange line. Other states have provisions where property taxes are either tied to market value or reset to market value when property is sold, but this is not the case in Oregon. With a constitutional limit of 3% growth for existing properties, plus new taxable construction, the current upper limits of taxable assessed value growth in Eugene is approximately 4%. This is very different from other government revenue streams, such as income taxes or sales taxes, which don't have an upper limit to how fast they can grow. The only ways to materially exceed our current assessed value growth rates would be massive new taxable construction or legislative property tax reform at the state level. This topic typically arises during legislative sessions, but comprehensive property tax reform has not yet gained enough traction. And on the right there, you can see a rough formula is that it takes around $200 million of new taxable construction to generate $1 million of general fund revenue. To give that amount some perspective, Valley River Center has a real market value of $119 million and is currently our second largest property taxpayer. So on the last slide, we talked about how property taxes have built-in limits on how fast they can grow. This is very different from other revenue sources that follow economic cycles without any such limits. As an example, these two charts show recent growth of two major revenue sources for the state of Oregon, as described in their March revenue forecast. The chart on the left shows personal income tax withholdings that come from worker paychecks. These withholdings are growing at roughly double the rate seen during the last expansion, which is driven by tight labor markets putting upward pressure on wages. The chart on the right shows corporate excise taxes. This chart represents traditional corporate income taxes and does not include the new corporate activity tax. After a temporary drop at the beginning of the pandemic, corporate tax collections immediately bounced back and continue to set new records. The state economist stated that corporate taxes are up 50% since the start of the pandemic and a whopping 140% over the last 4 years. So now let's look at general fund expenses, where personnel is the largest category at 75% of total expenses. Similar to the revenue table we saw a few slides back, the table on the right shows actual average annual growth of general fund expenses over the last 3 full fiscal years. Personnel expenses generally grow faster than materials and services due to cost increases above typical inflation, such as healthcare and PERS. Non-departmental expenses are primarily made up of transfers out to other funds. The high growth rate of non-departmental expenses during this timeframe is due to transfers out to the Community Safety Fund, to the SDC Capital Projects Fund to reimburse construction excise tax offsets, and to distress funds such as the ambulance transport and parking funds. The average growth rate across all expenses in the general fund over the last 3 years was 4.4%, exceeding the revenue growth rate of 3% over the same time frame. This is accomplished by drawing down reserves, which makes it difficult to add ongoing services or to build adequate reserves to weather unanticipated events. Without corrective action, the forecast projects that the same trend will continue, with expenses growing faster than revenues over the coming years. So now let's talk about PERS expenses and discuss the impact of the next major rate increase that's coming in FY24. The top half of this table shows Eugene-specific employer contribution rates as a percentage of payroll, and the bottom half shows the estimated PERS cost in the general fund and across all city funds combined. PERS rate changes occur in even years, so the FY23 rates shown here are the same as FY22. The FY24 rates shown here in the table are advisory rates provided to us by the PERS actuary. As you can see, the advisory rate increase is significant and will cause an estimated 24% increase in PERS costs in FY24 compared to FY23. This will add almost $5 million in ongoing expenses to the general fund and over $9 million across all city funds. The primary reason for the FY24 increase is that the PERS board took action last summer to lower the assumed investment rate of return from 7.2% to 6.9%, based on a strong recommendation from the actuary. A lower assumed investment return produces higher calculated liabilities and thus higher employer contribution rates to make up the difference. It's important to note that the FY24 advisory rates are based on the system valuation through calendar year 2020. But our actual FY24 rates will be based on the next system valuation through the end of 2021. This is a little bit of good news because 2021 produced strong investment returns of around 20%, which will help put some downward pressure on the next increase in employer contribution rates. However, we will not know the impact of the strong 2021 returns until our actual FY24 PERS rates are provided by the actuary in the fall. And you may recall the city participated in the PERS Employer Incentive Fund back in July of 2020, and the benefit of that investment is included in these numbers. The city made a one-time investment of $5 million and received a state match of $1.25 million, which provides the city with an annual rate reduction of approximately 0.4% of payroll. The savings associated with this rate reduction are estimated to be around $500,000 in FY22 And over the full 20-year amortization period, the city's PERS costs will be reduced by an estimated $11.4 million due to participation in the Employer Incentive Fund. Inflation is a hot topic these days as consumers, businesses, and governments across the country feel the effect of higher prices for goods and services. According to the state economist, the biggest challenge today remains the supply side of the economy. It is not that supply chains are broken. Rather, given the strong consumer demand, supply chains are overloaded. The economy is producing, transporting, and selling record volumes. However, those records have not been able to keep pace with demand. The Oregon Office of Economic Analysis issues inflation forecasts 4 times per year, and this is the most current forecast. They issue the forecast in quarterly increments, and we convert the data to line up with our fiscal years. The solid line on the left shows actual inflation through FY21, and the dashed line on the right shows the inflation forecast starting in FY22. As you can see, the inflation is currently expected to peak at 5.7% in FY22 before coming back down to 2.7% in FY23 and then down to the low 2% range in FY24 and beyond. The forecast would be significantly impacted if inflation continues to remain elevated. For example, if the out-year inflation rates are 1% higher than shown here, forecasted expenses would increase by an estimated $23 million over the forecast period. So before we look at the condition of the current forecast, here's a reminder of the $3.3 million worth of general fund one-time investments from the FY22 adopted budget. Being one-time, these items do not automatically roll forward beyond FY22 in the budget or the forecast. And just a quick disclaimer that we are operating in a dynamic environment, and the forecast is tied to a set of assumptions based on what we know at a point in time. The current forecast is a work in progress as we continue to make updates in preparation for the upcoming proposed budget. This may change the forecast you see in April when the city manager presents the FY23 proposed budget. So now we'll look at the annual operating surplus deficit, which helps us understand if we are living within our means. I'm going to show you the lines one at a time so that we can compare the FY22 adopted budget forecast against the current forecast. First, I'd like to point out the red dotted line in the middle of the chart, which represents a neutral position where revenues equal expenditures. Anything above the red line is a surplus, and anything below the red line is a deficit. The result of a surplus is an increase in reserves, while a deficit reduces reserves. So the solid blue line shows the forecasted surplus deficit as of the FY22 adopted budget. It's important to note that the adopted budget forecast assumed an ongoing $2.5 million reduction strategy starting in FY24. The green dashed line represents the current forecast, which includes the changes we discussed today. The current forecast also includes an estimated $9.7 million reduction strategy phased in incrementally over 3 years starting in FY24. The need for this larger reduction strategy is primarily driven by the loss of Comcast revenue and the significant PERS rate increase coming in FY24. Even though FY23 shows a projected deficit, we can manage this deficit without reductions in FY23 due to the $6.2 million addition to the reserve for revenue shortfall approved during the FY22 December supplemental budget. These extra reserves allow us to hold off reductions until FY24 when the next PERS rate increase kicks in. As a result of the ongoing $9.7 million reduction strategy, the surplus deficit improves to a neutral position in FY25 and then to a modest surplus position in the out years of the forecast. And now we'll talk about our savings account, also known as the reserve for revenue shortfall. This reserve is our financial cushion, which is a key part of our financial management. Having an adequate reserve allows us to weather unexpected events and take time to develop thoughtful, strategic responses rather than having to take immediate action to cut services. In other words, maintaining reserves in good economic times is the key to weathering recessionary periods with minimal service disruptions. Additionally, having a sufficient reserve is a factor in our high credit rating, which translates into lower borrowing costs for the city, saving taxpayer resources over the long term. Our credit rating agency, Moody's, recognizes the strong financial management of the city, including maintaining strong reserve levels, which is a key metric in their valuation. So this line represents our savings account target of 8% of general fund expenditures, or about $15.2 million annually on average over the forecast period. The solid blue line shows the forecasted reserve as of the FY22 adopted budget. As noted on the previous slide, the adopted budget forecast assumed an ongoing $2.5 million reduction strategy starting in FY24. And the green dashed line represents the current forecast, which includes the previously mentioned $9.7 million ongoing reduction strategy. You can see the reserve level drop from FY23 to FY24 due to the deficit that we saw on the last slide. The reduction strategy stabilizes the reserve at $4 million in FY24 and FY25 before making modest improvements in the out years, eventually reaching 4% of expenditures by the end of the forecast period. The last topic I'd like to cover tonight is a few areas of uncertainty as we look to the future. Although we've heard mostly good news about the pandemic recently, with cases dropping and mask mandates being lifted, the future is unknown. If cases start going up again, or if a new variant emerges, the city's finances could be affected. And many funds were adversely affected by the pandemic and have not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels. Staff are closely monitoring distressed funds to evaluate if additional financial support is necessary for fund stability. And earlier I mentioned the loss of $3.2 million of Comcast revenue annually. There is also an additional $1 million per year that Comcast could potentially stop paying, but so far they don't think the court decision was clear enough to do so. We reviewed the current inflation forecast, but there is a degree of uncertainty about when inflation will return to typical levels, particularly considering current global events. If inflation persists longer than the state economists expects, this could have a significant impact on the forecast. And current worker shortages have put upward pressure on wages, impacting employers across the country, and it's uncertain how long this trend will last. The PERS actuary is projecting that future PERS rate increases beyond FY24 will ease, but that can change depending on market returns and other factors. And the forecast presented today does not include ongoing funding for many services we have funded on a one-time basis recently, such as sustainable funding for climate and homelessness services. As the organization shifts to a new strategic planning and budget process, we will continue to model the financial impact to assess our situation and remain flexible to adapt to new information, whether it has a positive or negative impact on our financial condition. And let's wrap up with a quick look at the upcoming timeline. The next step in the budget committee process will be the city manager's presentation of the FY23 proposed budget in late April, followed by budget committee meetings in May. At the May meetings, there will be opportunities for public input and budget committee deliberation before making a recommendation to the city council. And this concludes the financial condition update, and I'll hand it back over to the chair.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate that presentation. Very informative. And I have a randomized speaking order for a round robin for people who might have questions. So we're going to start with Catherine Ryan. And then she'll be followed by Councilor Zelenka.
I don't think I have anything at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Zelenka, followed by Eliza Kaczynski.
Pass, Chairman.
Eliza will be followed by Siobhan Cancel.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was extremely informative, if not overly cheerful. I had two questions. Is part of the reason why the reduction strategies aren't being looked at until 2024 is to sort of give some time for us to look at this new budgeting process that we're talking about, to kind of hopefully get some certainty about things that are uncertain before we start making those kinds of decisions? Is that an accurate assumption?
Totally, totally accurate.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, there was talk about reduction strategies in there being folded into there. Are there talks, is there going to be talk about revenue strategies as well? I feels like most of the revenue discussions have focused on specific current unfunded needs, as opposed to offsetting potential reductions. Is that going to be part of that conversation too?
Yeah, I think we don't have a scheduled, like, here's when we're going to talk about revenue, but there's been a couple of, that topic has come up a couple of times around, especially around homelessness and climate. So I would anticipate that we would need to address that as well.
And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Siobhan will be followed by Councillor Semple.
I do not have any questions at this time. Thanks.
Councillor Semple followed by Councillor Groves.
Thank you. I'd like to see the page of the one-time expenditures right now. It went too fast for me.
Sure, let me bring that back up and share my screen. Right, and let me get to the right spot. Oh, here we go.
Councillor Semple, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. I can't see myself, so this is great. Can I like print it off the slides we got, because I'd like to look at it more.
Sure, and I actually did take this right from the FY22 adopted budget document.
Okay.
Or the online version, so we can, it's there, we can certainly send you a link right to this page.
That would be perfect, and I'd so appreciate it. Thank you. Sure.
One thing I'll say, that the chart in the document does have some ongoing line items as too. For this purpose, I took those out. This just shows the one time, but we'll get you that link straight to this page.
Okay, thanks, really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Because yikes, look at downtown.
Councillor Groves followed by Ryan Kanofsky.
Thank you, Chair. I do not have any questions at this time.
Ryan followed by Councillor Ye.
Thank you. I do not have any comments at this time.
Councillor Ye followed by Raina Jackson.
Oh, it's my turn. Sorry.
Yeah, I had.
Okay.
Looks like we lost Councillor Ye. So yes, go ahead, Raina.
Okay.
And you'll be followed by Councillor Syret.
Okay. Yeah, I just had one question. We may or may not have the answer, but has Comcast given any indication about the 1 million, about if they are appealing that or are seeking to stop that payment at some time in the future?
I haven't heard the last I heard was what they told us in the fall, that they didn't feel the court case was enough to make that payment, but I don't know if the city attorney or someone else has any other information. If not, we can get back to you if we know anything different or newer.
That was it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councilor Sarette?
No questions here, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't think I have any particular questions either. I'm concerned about what it's going to look like when we have to start putting in those bigger reduction strategies than we talked about before, but that's not in this fiscal year's budget. So we'll see that in the future. In the meantime, thank you so much. I really appreciate the presentation. That brings us to the next item on our agenda, which is our budget process update. So once again, I will hand things over to our city manager.
Thank you so much, Ty. I'm going to kind of do some co-presenting here, and I'm not running the slides, so I'll let Abby sort of pull up that first splash screen. But I really appreciate the reminder about the forecast. It's definitely a kind of a weather report for us. And as we kind of move into the next part of this, we're going to move from the numbers definitely to more of the approach. It's going to be a lot of information. We want to make sure you have time to ask questions, for you to have time to think about this after the fact and reach out and ask questions. And we're here with a couple of people that are going to be your trip companions. So I don't know if you're going to pull that up, Abby. Okay, thanks. And I promised you that we were going to do a metaphor shift. And so that's going to happen tonight too. So a lot of really exciting things happening tonight. And you can move the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about where we've been. I think she's struggling to get the slide moved.
I am struggling, just a moment.
It doesn't want to move. It's like, no,
it doesn't want
we
to
don't
move.
want to change metaphors.
Bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing and try.
We'll try again. It wouldn't be a public meeting if we didn't have a screen share issue or somebody muted.
Did you run out of gas? Are you stuck in the mud?
You know, you're just going to have to wait and see.
Technological resistance to changing metaphors may be a metaphor in and of itself.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to get Chris Fabian's sort of perspective of this overall meeting, since he's been in many municipal local government budget meetings. So when we get done, he'll be like, wow, I've seen that so many times, or I've never seen that before. All right, so looking back, I do want to just think about where we've been together on this journey. So before we switch our metaphors, I got a couple more, but I was thinking back about our first meeting that we had when I started in this role. Our very first meeting in person, and I'm sure you guys remember it too, was out at Second and Chambers. It was a similar presentation. We had Maurizio there. And it was right at the beginning of the coronavirus. And I remembered somebody asked a question, it may have been Councilor Groves, about, hey, you know, Interim Chief Heppel, do you know anything about this coronavirus? And Chris sort of stood up and was like the beginning of his encyclopedia of knowing it. But none of us could have known on that day the challenges that we had ahead of us. So I think about FY21, and just in terms of my career, the uniqueness of putting together a budget, working really hard through that, and it was immediately irrelevant. And we were coming to you with an amended budget. So you remember I had like the budget message, and then we had a new budget and a new budget message before we ever even presented. And that, I don't think that's ever happened before in my career that I can remember. There's probably somebody here that says, no, we've done that once, but that and the multiple supplemental budgets that we've had to use to adapt and get through this time and keep our services whole and keep our employees employed. The way that you've provided advice and guidance through those supplemental budgets, and then again through FY22. I just want to say I have a lot of gratitude as I look back at just sort of your perseverance and resilience and leadership. Next slide. That said, we still have a lot of challenges ahead. And I think about, there's the ones we know about, which I've talked about. I'm trying to make this a little bit different than the council presentation just to keep you on board with me. But the ones that we know ahead are, the forecast, which we just had. We know we have some financial holes. We know we have some ongoing impacts from COVID. We don't know exactly what those are. We have emerging needs around housing, climate action, alternative response, equity. We have pretty big ambitious goals, and we don't, we know all of that. And then we also have a lot of challenges that we probably don't know about yet. So when I think about that day on the fire station, what we couldn't have possibly known, there's still some of that possibility ahead of us, which is why it's really important that we continue to provide this financial stability and leadership together. Next slide. That said, at some point you have to leave base camp. And base camp as the reference, and the reason I use that as a metaphor was I knew we had a tremendous challenge ahead of us. And it's, base camp is where you have the right team, you have the right resources, and you're sort of waiting and working to achieve that one major goal and that one major milestone. And here we are, we're a couple of years into it. We have limited supplies, and we also need a far longer look. It's not about one challenge, one mountain. It's much more of a journey. We need some different choices. And I think, it's not a one and done trip. And so it also just feels like it's a little bleak, it's a little cold, and I wanted to shift it up so we can realize we're on a journey, but we're gonna have a little bit more fun, even if it's tough. So next slide. So we're moving on, and we're always gonna remember this work together. I think we always will. We'll always say, do you remember when we did that? And you remember when we guided this organization and this community through one of its most difficult times in its history, and you were here, we did this together, and it served us well. As we've kind of transitioned to this new approach and new metaphor, that we've made some choices that make that possible. You asked that question about, why is it we're not doing this in FY24? And part of it is, the need to shift our approach, and I feel very strongly and passionately about that. The need to shift our approach, we need some time to do that. Our teams need some time. They need a little bit of a rest year. And the idea of trying to shift our approach, learn new things, get through training, and be, making reductions just feels really, really difficult. So we made some good choices. The decision for us to save money and to put that marginal beginning working capital in reserves gives us a little bit of space and room to do that. The infusion of ARPA funds has given us a lot of stability and ability to have a little bit of flexibility and kind of like even us out over the next couple of years. That decision to make an investment in PERS was really significant. And so we're really continuing to try not to overreact and to just take it a year at a time, be focused on the future, make sure we're being financially sound, but also do good work. So I just want to say, thank you. It's a lifetime memory, but we are moving on. Next slide. So we're off the mountain and we are on a road trip. And this is going to just be way more fun. I just have to say, there's just so many more possibilities for photos and connections. But
who knew we were so young and good looking?
I know. Well, I knew. I mean, I was like, where can I find a photo that most looks like us? So we're on a longer and a little bit more sustainable journey together. We're not hunkered down in base camp waiting for the big piece. We're going to be working and planning together. We're going to have some destinations, some choices. We're going to have rest stops. I want folks to, it was really interesting. And I think there's not that many cities in the country where you would have had a significant conversation around, okay, so if we're going on a road trip, what kind of a sustainable vehicle are we taking? Are we in a car? Are we in an RV? Are we in an electric vehicle? Are we on a bike? And so you can insert whatever form of transportation you want into this. I think it's the point of it is really just we're on a trip and we need to have a little bit better music for one. Next slide. All right. Why is music important? And Chris Fabian is like, how is this possibly part of a budget presentation anywhere? But I will just say, I think there's a really strong connection between music and memories and place. And of course, I'm not playing music right now. Maybe I will at our next one. But I sort of have these like very distinct memories in my life, one of which was several summers I traveled in Guatemala and Belize, and we had 2 8-track tapes in the van that we were traveling in. One of them was the Cars' Candy-O, and the other one was Billy Joel, The Stranger. And if you play any one of those songs at any time, I'm immediately transported back into that space. And it's a really good way to just sort of create and frame our time together. I also want to just say it's really important that we find some joy in this work. One of my life missions is to make really difficult work fun and to try to build some resilience in the team to continue to want to continue tackling these difficult problems. So even though it's very, very serious work, I think we can have a playful approach and find something in it for everybody while we go through these difficult things. We, worst case scenario is we're burning folks out. And I know that's happening across the country in every industry, and it's happening at the city of Eugene. And so it is important to me we find a way to laugh and be playful and enjoy our trip together. Next slide. So all great road trips, are really a mix of having a map and a plan, but also just being pretty spontaneous and flexible along the way. Some of your best memories are the ones that you've had to be like, I didn't even know we were going to go there, but there was that sign and there was that place or there was that festival and we just showed up there and that was the best part. I assume things are going to happen like that as we go forward. We're going to plan and things are going to come up. I used to use way back when triptychs were paper. I don't know if anybody ever used the AAA triptychs, but you would say, hey, I'm going from here to there. And they would give you a stack of maps with the highlighted route, and there'd be a companion guide of potential destinations along the way. So Chris Fabian and Resource X are sort of like our AAA triptych for this journey. And you're going to get a chance to hear from him in a little bit about the work that they do and how they're going to help us. But I think, what I'm still looking for, and I've been looking for and talking to you about since the first presentation, is that we have some sort of stable rhythm together, that we have a way of working where we're doing work out in the community, understanding what their needs are, what their hopes are, that we're setting those goals with the city council, that we're doing some strategic planning, that we're finding ways to implement and take action on those items, that we're, resourcing it through the budget process and getting feedback, and that we're in this rhythm that is predictable and sustainable and just a really good best practice. And so one of the things that we introduced at a council meeting a couple of weeks ago is that part of that rhythm is in shifting this process could be to go to a 2-year budget process. That brought up a lot of questions in the city council meeting. And so we're not going to actually cover that tonight. I think tonight what we would like to do is just focus on the priority-based budget part of that and really drill in, understand some more information from Chris, and then we'll come back to you and we will talk specifically about what a different budget cycle might look like. And importantly, I think with all of this is that all good road trips have good stories and ways to measure how many miles you have to go and how far you've been and what you've seen and what you've done. And that whole idea of telling our story better, I'm hoping, is one of the major themes that comes out of this shift in our process. Next slide. So we're still fun, Claire. We're still we're having a good time. It is really going to be a team effort. And so I'm excited tonight to be joined by Abby Alway, who's our project manager, and Chris Fabian from Resource X to kind of start to talk more about that team. And really, I'm still I'm just going to keep going with it. We want people to stay engaged and stay resilient. And so if we have to buy a convertible to do it, we'll do that. So with that, I'm going to introduce Chris Fabian, who's patiently listened through all of this to talk about the work at Resource X, priority-based budgeting, and specifically is going to address some of the questions that came out at the city council meeting. So welcome, Chris.
Hey, thank you so much. That was incredible. And the whole time I'm thinking how am I going to weave this in? What car am I driving? It's obviously a ragtop, but I'm very pleased to be on this journey together with you. That is for sure. And I'm going to share my screen here and try to weave in some stories from the road. And everyone, thank you so much for having me in your meeting tonight. I'm in Denver, Colorado, where we are headquartered. It's lightly snowing outside. Not a whole lot of travel taking place right now, but I'm so pleased to be here to talk about priority-based budgeting, especially after hearing and watching the financial forecast. This is why we created this particular company. I come from the public sector, and I didn't necessarily dream that I would be working in the budget. However, the budget has turned out to be one of the most extraordinary points of leverage for trying to make sure we have the resources we need to fund our road trip ahead, the journey that we want to go on with our communities. I worked in local government here in Colorado in a county called Jefferson County, just west of Denver. And when all of this work began for me, I was supporting my board of elected officials as they were trying to look out towards their future and address so many of the needs of the community, but feeling like we couldn't, because every time we looked at a financial forecast, the resources were never there. And what really sank in for me became my life's work. And the fact is, we will always be in a situation where we feel like we don't have the resources that we need to pursue everything we want to do. And what we've tried to do at Resource X is to question that and say, what would it take? Imagine if we did have enough gas in the tank or voltage in our electric vehicle overall. And so the purpose of our work is to make sure that you all, as you're trying to go forth and achieve amazing things for the city of Eugene, whether it's trying to tackle some of the homelessness challenges you face or pursue solutions and initiatives for your climate action work, that you know what your options are, and that resource scarcity is not your barrier. And through priority-based budgeting, we're going to try to help you see the budget in a new way to try and ensure that you have the resources you need to pursue your vision. So for my presentation flow, the road ahead tonight, I've actually framed it around a series of questions. And I'll just kind of walk us through. These are questions that are most likely on your mind. And I'll go one by one in a sort of self-interview style, or the soundtrack, if you will. Before I get to the 4 questions, I thought it'd be helpful to give a 1-slide, very brief overview of the methodology that we call priority-based budgeting. If I use an acronym tonight, it would be PBB, not to be confused with PBR, but priority-based budgeting 101. So as far as our map for the road ahead, most communities we work with, when it comes to the budget, we have our line item budget, our resource data, which is how we characterize the revenues coming in, everything from Maurizio's great presentation. And that is fantastic. That's how we establish appropriation and spending controls. But in some ways, when we start to think about what our options are to generate new resources, or to perhaps reallocate from within, or to prioritize, sometimes the line item data can be a bit limiting for the types of conversations that we want to get into. So that the methodology is, we're still keeping the line item data, but we're just slipping beneath it and recentering the conversation on the programs and services that we actually provide. These are, my metaphor here is I'm layering data like you would on a map, where if we establish the conversation or the foundation of our dialogue at the program level, what programs do we need to be doing more of? What programs can we imagine doing less of? Where might we partner? That's where we're going to center our trade-off discussions overall at the program level. We attach the line item information to the programs, which simply means we're going to know what we do, every program and service that we offer and how much it costs us to do it with the resources that we have in the budget. The red layer, called basic program attributes, says we're going to learn some other things about the programs we provide, basic things, such as, is the program mandated? Are we required to provide a program? Or is it something in our own city charter or our local ordinances or resolutions? Is it a statewide mandate, a federal mandate? We might want to know, what population does this program serve? Is it geared towards a specific portion of our constituency or our community, or does it serve the entirety of the public? We'll want to know if the program is increasing in demand or if the demand for the program is actually decreasing, and we might find ourselves in a situation where we can partner or find another entity to share the workload. That's the red layer overall. So all of this, we're just attaching information to the program so that you have everything you need to know to really help inform trade-off decisions that you might make. The yellow layer is, what does this program do for us, do for our community? What is the impact that this program has on making us safer or increasing the health and well-being of our community, those being outcomes that we seek to achieve? What about economic vitality or transportation and mobility and those sorts of things? And then finally, the purple layer, what we call the program's future direction, very much a journey ahead or road ahead type of mentality. We're going to think about, where are we headed with this program? What's its fate? What's its trajectory? Are we hoping to grow the program and provide more and more resources to it? And that's a good thing for the future of our community. Or is the program on a trajectory where we might sunset it? Is the program on a trajectory where we're going to hope to bring in more revenues to fund it, or other options that we might come up with overall? And when you think about it, when we start to imagine the future direction for every program we provide, that's really where the budget comes into play, trying to understand, do we have the resources to put behind this program for the outcomes that we wish to achieve? In doing so, this is the process of priority-based budgeting. The more that we can connect data layers is one way to say it, or learn, another way to say it is learn about each and every program we provide and what our options are. You see this red line says our insights for opportunities to change the way we provide programs increase, and they increase quite a lot from our experience. And so the shift that we will go through is from really seeing our budget from a line item perspective on the left-hand side to something that's program-based and priority-based in terms of how we have resources funding the programs that we're providing to our community and the outcomes that we hope to achieve in order to drive these options in front of us. And that's priority-based budgeting 101. This is the process that we're going through. So one of the questions that I imagine might be on your minds is, how will the priority-based budgeting process look and feel different from our current process overall? And I'm going to try to help you visualize what this looks like. If I had a soundtrack of audio tapes, that might help to make that memory more concrete. But here I'm demonstrating, this is one of our clients in their budget book, and it has many of the familiar terms that you just saw from Maurizio's presentation. We have revenues, all sorts of great revenues. We have expenses, and we look at them over the years. And I want you to imagine if you could see this exact same information, the exact same budget, everything adding up to the same amount of money. But if you saw it in terms of opportunities in front of you, so here, this is the same organization. You're able to see how much we're investing in programs or how much opportunity is on the table for revenue changes, where we have palatable, appropriate ways that we might act entrepreneurially to generate new revenues. What if we could see the budget in terms of the programs and the efficiencies that we could reap to save money? Certainly, some of our programs are on a trajectory for status quo. Hey, the program's running smoothly. We don't imagine it needs more resources, and probably imagine that we can't do without the resources that it has. So status quo is perfectly fine. We just don't want every program to be on autopilot. And down the line, from insourcing and partnerships where you could be a partner provider and other entities pay you for a service that you provide to the region. There could be revenue opportunities, service level increases, and resource repurposing overall. This is what we're going to try to change the lens for how you view your budget in terms of the opportunities before you. So it's not always just thinking of how do we balance the budget for a projected shortfall, but how can we really identify and explode all of the opportunities that we have to either repurpose resources or generate new revenue overall. I want to show you quite simply what this could look like. So this is another one of our clients where for every program that they are evaluating in the budget, from basic median and streetscape maintenance to payroll processing, they talk about the future and the trajectory for that particular program in the budget. And I would hope that this looks and feels a little bit differently, that for every program we're coming to consider, how does it help us achieve the outcomes that are most important for our community overall? Is the program mandated? And what is the future budget recommendation? If you distilled these to a simple story for this organization, this is Littleton, Colorado, a suburb of Denver. Median and streetscape maintenance here is on a service level increase trajectory. They're asking for more money overall to provide this particular program. And over on the payroll processing side, we can see that it's not that they're decreasing the service level, but if you read the description in great detail, you'd find out they're providing the same level of service for less resources overall. And so this is a program efficiency. And this chart that I just dropped in, this is how we view the budget, is we're always trying to have a balance. Over on the left-hand side of this blueprint or this roadmap, it says for our communities, we will always imagine that we have new needs. For you, it might be addressing some of the homelessness challenges that you're facing, some of your climate action plan, infrastructure improvements, and so on and so forth. And we never want to neglect those. We want to ensure that we are always imagining all of the programs that are on a service level increase trajectory. In this case, in my simple example for median maintenance, it's $12,730. And how do we fund our new needs? It can come about from two different ways. We can reallocate the current budget that we have, so freeing up and reallocating resources, or we can generate new revenue. And I think one of the council members, Councilmember Kaczynski, brought that up, that it's both resource reallocation opportunities and the revenue generating ideas as well. So in our payroll processing, they found a program efficiency and it's saving $21,000. So in this very basic, simple diagram, we can see we're going to try to understand all of the programs and services where we actually need to level up and come to understand what that might cost us on top of balancing the budget, as Maurizio led us through. And then in order to balance that, we're going to find every possible opportunity to free up and reallocate resources, and every opportunity we might have for generating new revenue when it's very possible that some of our revenue sources might actually be a drain on this equation overall. By showing those two simple examples, imagine scaling that up now across the 200 or 300 programs that you might have across the entire city, certainly within the general fund, and a skill set that is, we believe, really important for being able to budget and achieve your vision here in the 21st century is substantial resource reallocation. Some of our communities who have been through priority-based budgeting for some time have been able to identify, free up, and reallocate resources on the order of 10% of their budget or more. That's what you're seeing over here on the right-hand side of my chart. We produced an annual impact report earlier this year, and we recognize the tremendous accomplishments from some of our communities as they're really focused on coming up with ways to reallocate resources. Because if we can do that, then we are not at the mercy of changes, not completely at the mercy of changes in our environment and in our local economy, but we might be able to come up with the resources we need to fund a far better future. And over here on the left-hand side, This is one of our most recent examples. I'll tell more of this story in just a moment. But the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, really strongly pursuing their climate action plan, but feeling like they didn't have the resources to be able to do it, identified opportunities around $41 million from their budget to try to point towards funding an unfunded climate action plan. Last thing I'll say about this skill of resource liquidity, you look at, this is actually one other chart of some communities just 1 year ago. You take Shawnee, Kansas, who managed to find resource reallocation opportunities of 15.3 million. And then if you look over on the left-hand side, I'm showing you what they received from ARPA resources, 7.5 million. Here's East Lansing, Michigan, who has been able to free up and reallocate about 8.3 million of their budget through priority-based budgeting. They received a little bit more, but on par, about 12 million from ARPA. And then finally, not too far from City of Eugene, Salem, Oregon, has been able to free up and reallocate about 25 million in their budget compared to ARPA resources of about 34 million. Definitely that's higher. But a dream for us is, we consider ARPA this fantastic, maybe once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to receive the bounty and abundance of resources we need to really pursue great changes in our community. And our hope, our aspirational goal is that communities will find a way to master the skills of resource reallocation to create ongoing sustainable resources on par with something like ARPA every year. That's a dream. That's where we would love to be able to get to if we can master this idea of resource liquidity. I hope that through this, the answer to the question, how will this look or feel differently? I hope that you will start to consider the way that the budget is presented as trade-off decisions, that you have various programs. You could provide them, you could find a partner, you could provide the program more efficiently. You could stop providing the program altogether, take the resources and reallocate in order to ensure that you have enough money to fund some of those programs that really need to grow. Next question was, has to do with what other cities are doing. What are other innovative cities doing with priority-based budgeting to address problems or do things differently, like sustainability, homelessness, climate change, and what are they gaining? I'll highlight two examples. I started to tell the story of Pittsburgh and how they came to implement priority-based budgeting, starting with this frustration, really, that they have a bold climate action plan and just felt like they did not have the resources to fully put it into play. The previous slide was Mayor Peduto speaking in Glasgow at the climate conference a little bit earlier last year. So here's Pittsburgh with his version 3.0 of a tremendous climate action plan. We partner often with Bloomberg Philanthropies on communities who are pursuing climate goals, as well as some of their equity goals. And I'll tell you a story from Denver, Colorado in just a moment as well. But Pittsburgh reached out to us with this kind of gnawing problem of really wondering if they can come through on some of their climate commitments, and following this exact same process, program inventory, program costing, evaluating programs, are they mandated or not? What portion of the community do they serve? And then generating the program's future direction. They followed the blueprint, and this is exactly how they identified the $41 million for resource reallocation. Notice on the right-hand side, this is that same blueprint I was showing just a moment ago. Numerous ideas came from, might we outsource a program where we have a partner who can help us provide it? That was 29 of their insights. Program efficiencies, where they could provide a program at the same service level for less money. They had 20 recommendations for really just decreasing the level of service or stopping some programs altogether that had lost their relevance over time. Many local governments find themselves in a position where they are offering programs, and they have been for a long period of time, and maybe they were relevant in the past, and you look to today and they're less relevant. That's okay. And what can we do to free up and reallocate those resources? On the revenue side, they generated 50 additional program-specific recommendations, amounting to about $17.8 million. And this is what we're hoping to do. So without counting on our local economy providing the resources to help us generate 41 million. How can we do it ourselves? And if our local tax base and rates add additional resources to the equation, all the better. We're just saying our mentality is kind of like leave no stone unturned. We're going to try to look at all other options on the table and maximize your position to know what you can do to balance the budget and beyond, fund some of the programs that you need for the future. City of Denver, Colorado, where I live, had a very similar situation, but instead of focusing on a climate action approach, they are trying to create a more equitable city overall. But the interesting thing when Denver called was that they had spent a lot of time really defining specifically what their equity objective could look like, where nobody's future is predetermined based on their race or ethnicity, and instead opportunities are open to all. However, even with a clearly defined objective, they started an equity office and hired their first chief equity officer. It just felt like as the budget process rolled out, they were getting the same old types of budget recommendations. In fact, just before this meeting tonight, we were talking to the chief equity officer for the city of Los Angeles, and it's the exact same storyline where you lay out a great vision, but the budget recommendations coming in just don't seem to be the types of things you're hoping for to move the needle. And as we started to work with Denver, what we noticed, back to our layering slide for putting together priority-based budgeting data, is that when it came to the budget process, as departments were trying to conceive of how they could help create budget requests that move the needle on equity, when they're confronted with their basic line item data, it was non-intuitive. So we would talk with Public Works and they'd say, well, here we are, I spend $2 million on cleaning supplies and materials. Here I've got tools and other equipment or leases and rentals. Their point was, you tell me, what am I supposed to do to make a budget recommendation on cleaning supplies that has to do with the mayor's bold vision for equity? And it makes total sense why that's such a hard thing to do. But instead, when we can shift it, remember I said we're going to recenter the conversations at the program level, not the line item level, and say all of these are important buckets or component costs of what it takes to provide snow removal. Snow removal is a program, and we can really talk about that program in light of the overall equity definition. It's exactly what Denver did to create better budget recommendations overall. And that's exactly the position where we want them to be. So in Denver, just like tonight, it turns out that there are many areas of the city, portions of neighborhoods where vehicle ownership is non-existent. And the residents of those neighborhoods really depend on a high quality sidewalk network to be able to get from their homes to access to public transportation and be able to get to their place of work or to City Hall or the grocery store. And when it snows like crazy and the sidewalks become icy, they're impassable, creating a barrier from a perspective of equity for economic opportunity. And so the budget recommendation was, let's take snow removal and let's provide snow removal and ice removal on sidewalks in particular neighborhoods where we know vehicle ownership is low, and that will reduce some of our disparities. And that's a higher level of service. It's a service level increase, left-hand side of the blueprint. It needs more money than they provide in any other part of the city and county of Denver. So that's great. We want more of those types of recommendations, even though they cost more. And then we'd have to go to the right-hand side of the blueprint and find resource reallocation opportunities and revenue generating ideas to make sure that we can come through and fund this type of solution overall. So we get super excited about this because whether it's snow and ice removal on sidewalks for economic opportunity and access, or rethinking revenues, really, Denver took their impound lot and came to recognize that some of the fees are a barrier for people to get their car back. These are the types of budget recommendations that we want to generate in mass. And then we just work that equation. Where can we reallocate? Where can we generate new revenues and resources? Mindful of Maurizio's overall plan to balance the budget and work on your reserves, all of that has to stay intact. But we don't have to ever give up or fall short on our vision for really pursuing equity or homelessness, people experiencing homelessness issues or climate action overall. All right. How will this priority-based budgeting process, which might seem complex, increase transparency and engagement and or make decision-making easier? Well, I used that example earlier of the city of Littleton. This might be a little bit small on the screen. I apologize, but hopefully you can just look at the big numbers. Here's this is a budget request from one year to the next, and we're looking at non-personnel line items that add up. In this case, I think you can read that hopefully of 32,000, and the next year they're down to 27,000. And if you wanted to see all the detail, you could find out, you know, what changed. Was it professional services or books and magazine subscriptions or what have you? And the challenge here from a decision maker's lens is that it's awfully hard to understand, is this a good situation or are we worse off that the costs are going down? We're always trained to think that savings are good, but maybe this is not the best overall trajectory. And I'll move those down for a second. Maybe we can look at personnel costs and we can see FTE going from 1.2 to 0.95, and we're saving a little bit on the personnel side. This being line item portrayal of budget requests from one year to the next, with all the elected officials we've worked with over the years, it's very challenging. It's like a forest from the trees type of situation to know if this is a good direction or not. And so we find ourselves as decision makers really trying to scrutinize and understand, asking a bunch of questions to try to orient ourselves about the nature of the recommendation, where if we could drop in the bigger picture that this is that payroll processing program, it's the program itself that is a lot more intuitive. Hopefully you felt that as I dropped in payroll processing, that you can imagine payroll processing. You have people in your budget or finance office who are trying to make sure the rest of your staff get paid on time and that the calculations are taking place the right way. And it's very intriguing to watch the trajectory of this particular program, that it goes up in cost one year and it's coming back down. And if we did go back and scrutinize why that was happening, it turned out it was a vacant position on the personnel side. So as decision makers, we want you to have the big picture first. We want to have anticipated already the kinds of questions that you're going to ask. And that's why Littleton came up with this type of program report and all of the other details that priority-based budgeting pre-answers for you. You can come in and see, is this program mandated? It turns out that it is in Littleton. There's a state mandate to process payroll in a particular way. You can see how other agencies might provide payroll processing overall, and whether or not it's recovering its costs. It's not. Or how about change in demand? And then here's how payroll processing is scoring against the outcomes that really matter to the city of Littleton. We have a ranking system, a quartile ranking, which is like shorthand for relevance. Is this program really relating to the objectives that we have for our community? In this case, it's quartile 1, which means highly aligned. And that's really important to you as a decision maker, because you don't want a program that's really important to be decreasing from a service level perspective. You would ask, why would we cut a program that's so highly influential to the outcomes we strive to achieve? And in this case, you would feel satisfied at the end to hear, we're keeping the service level the exact same. We're just doing the program for less. It's a program efficiency. And how cool is that? We want you to have the full picture of how the program relates to your outcomes and what the resource requirement is to run the program smoothly. As we see more and more organizations pursue this type of approach, we see even their budget book starting to change, where this is meant to be like really frustrating to read. To an accountant, this is not frustrating. This is like very exciting and great information. But if we can pivot and see something simpler, in this case, this is a budget report from one of our clients near Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. You can see all of the programs in public works. Here's cemetery operations or trail and pathway maintenance overall. They have litter and garbage control and snow removal and traffic control and lighting. We can see the year-to-year resource changes in their proposed budget. And down below in the footnotes is the explanation, just like Littleton. Was it a program efficiency or a partnership, a service level decrease, a service level increase? What's behind the recommendation at the program level overall? And the kind of experiences that we see being reported that are really transformative of the budget are seeing that council's discussions are revolving around program and service level trade-offs and not necessarily the line item detail. Rest assured, all the line item detail is backing up how we get to those program costs, but it's not the centerpiece of the conversation, whether or not toner for our copy machines is going up. It's the bigger picture of the program trade-offs that we want you to be able to focus on. One of my last questions, and then we can pivot to any other questions that you have as well. It's a great question. Is PBB really going to help us prioritize and not do certain things anymore? How do we talk about prioritization without being alarmist, but conveying that there is a budget problem and this is going to help us address it? I think that's an awesome question. And I chose, in our work with Bloomberg Philanthropies, they have a program called What Works Cities. And part of the reason that we have a partnership with Bloomberg is back to this part in quotes. They have a criteria for evaluating excellence by their definition. And one of their specific criteria is asking, does your city have any evidence that it's not doing a particular program or reducing its funding? Because it's very hard to do that, as you all probably well know. So in my slide, this is one of their certification criteria. I'm choosing the city of South Jordan, Utah, and one of their high priority quartile 1 programs for business recruitment. And you see in business recruitment, there's a multi-year perspective where the very first year we worked together, they're investing in $370,000 into recruitment and retention of local businesses. So they're in the Salt Lake City metro area. We work with Salt Lake City as well. And they're focused on making sure that they are investing from an economic development perspective in making sure businesses are happy and they have the resources they need to thrive in the city of South Jordan. But you see, for even a high priority program, its cost went to $223,000, then down to $76,000, very much cut back, and finally resting at about $56,000. And so you might be thinking like, what's going on here? And the idea was right about the time that we started to work together, there was a Salt Lake City Metro Economic Development Corporation type of organization that emerged. And South Jordan was trying to figure out, well, if this EDC, Economic Development Corporation, is capable of doing business recruitment and retention, maybe we can pull back even on a high priority program overall and not have to duplicate efforts or invest so heavily, but we can take those resources and reinvest them into other areas that actually need more money, like left-hand side of the blueprint. And I love this kind of story because I hope that it addresses some of the skepticism that it's not just about cutting programs and reducing personnel. Resource reallocation can really help shift where your personnel are spending their time. And to see such a dramatic reduction of costs for a high priority program will hopefully give you a lot of confidence that this is the kind of thing that we're going to try to drive at a higher level. It's not just all about costs. It's about partnerships, about efficiencies. It can be about new revenue generation overall. My very last slide, I'm choosing a more dire situation. This is one of our communities, Washington County, Wisconsin, who has just seen the bottom fall out of their local economy. Taxes and their base property tax revenues have fallen almost by 10%. And what I find inspiring about this story is, even though that's the deck of cards they've been dealt, maybe a hole in the gas tank in the journey metaphor, most organizations would say, wow, 9% reduction overall in our predictable revenue streams. This is really bad news. and there's no way we're going to allow for new requests or budget increases for our departments. Usually the budget letter goes out in this situation and says, don't ask for new personnel. But look over on the left-hand side, during the same period of time, they have seen program growth to the tune of about 12% of their budget, $11.5 million. And so the only possible way to do this is to find so much more from a resource reallocation perspective. Washington County has reallocated about 13% of their budget over this period of time, and generated almost enough new revenue to offset this shortfall, about 8% in new revenue sources. So it's tempered it. It's almost flat on the revenue side, actually negative 1% overall. This is inspiring. Why? Because as local government practitioners, elected officials, decision makers, if we can't find a way to get the resources we need to the left-hand side of the equation, it's not like there are a bunch of other entities in the private sector just waiting in line to work on the homelessness challenges that you're facing or the climate action challenges that you're facing. It's really up to us. And if we are just so committed to understanding that you do have options, and this is hopefully inspirational for the direction that we all need to go. So that's priority-based budgeting. This is my blank slide transition to other pivot slides that I have in the slide deck. But I'll gladly stop here and see if there are any questions or reflections, or I know you do a round robin, so maybe I'll just pause.
Thank you so much, Chris. You know, we actually have a couple more slides that talk about the timeline, but I think we're going to pause here for a second and definitely turn it over to you, Ty. And if we want to come back to the timeline at the end, we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So before we jump into the round robin, I'm looking at the agenda and where we are time-wise. We had scheduled tonight's meeting without a break under the assumption we could finish by around 7:30 or a shade later. Can I get a quick show of hands of how many people have questions they want to ask in this round robin? Just trying to assess whether we can sprint through this or whether I should expect this to go on. It looks like maybe we have few enough questions that we can give this a try. So let's go ahead with a round robin on priority-based budgeting and see where we stand on the clock. So I'm going to go back to the same timeline or the same order we had before. And Catherine Ryan, followed by Councilor Zelenka.
Okay, I'm ready to go first this time. Now I know. So I have kind of, I think, a combination of like practical and philosophical questions. So it might depend who's kind of the right person to answer them. So the first one is just kind of clarity about like where we're at sort of with this, and like whether the decision has been made to go this route or we're exploring, just to kind of make sure that we know where we're at.
Yeah, thank you. We're going this route, and part of what Abby's presentation would be to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing this year and then what we're doing next year, because it's a ramp up to get there.
Awesome. And I know that there was sort of more of that detail in the council presentation. So that was sort of what I was thinking. Okay. Who, like, in thinking about sort of once all the stuff's in there, and like, I guess I'm curious about what the actual kind of prioritization part looks like in terms like who is deciding sort of how things are scored or ranked, and looking at all of that, and like what is the role of sort of like general counsel priorities relative to budget committee conversations, just kind of how those pieces are going to fit together. And I think during the council session there was also mention of sort of like community, like a specific community outreach effort related to this, and kind of getting feedback through that process as well.
I can give you a quick answer on the scoring. So built into the process, which I did not spend much time on tonight, is a departmental self-assessment for scoring, where they're literally taking every program they offer and scoring it against criteria, those basic program attributes. Is it mandated, size of population served, and outcomes that are most important. And so the department self-assessment appropriately puts departments in a place where they're the subject matter experts to try and self-score and give their opinion first. But that is followed up by a quality control step called peer review. And peer review is cross-departmental throughout the organization, organized around outcome teams to try to appropriately ask questions about the scores that the departments gave. So peer review will give their own assessment. And it's not that peer review is right or the department's right. In the process, we'll ferret out if there was material differences in the scores that were given overall, and try to pursue what is the best answer to the question. Does this program impact the safe community to a high degree? And what do we know about it with data and evidence overall? That's how, so it's not like the department chooses, hey, this program's a high priority. The prioritization is an outcome of the influence that the program can demonstrate against results.
And I think my question is more around like how does that criteria of sort of like what is important get set up in the first place that they're getting like scored against, or whatever that is called.
I think if any of the staff from Eugene want to talk about a strategic planning effort,
I'll do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, the baseline of all of this will be the rhythm I talked about earlier that we're working to get into, which is we're doing an annual community survey, or we're talking about updating our community survey, getting out, understanding what people's needs are. That's, really the baseline by which council sets their goals and their vision and outcomes. They've updated those last year, but we're anticipating as part of this that we do a little bit of a strategic planning process. We can talk about that a little bit later. That will actually set sort of strategic priorities and goals that we're trying to achieve. And that's kind of what you start to connect those attributes to.
Okay. I will wait for more to come on that one. And I guess sort of I'm curious, like what happens if kind of after going through this exercise, like the needs or sort of the desires still are like more than the revenue, and kind of, I guess, wrapped up in that is like whether staff feel like after, there was sort of like the reductions that were made over the last year, 2 years, kind of like, how much does it feel like there is to give at this point?
I can't tell, Chris, I can't tell if you're like, yeah, this is a total PBB question. I think, the beauty, one of the challenges and the beauties of our local government law is we have to have a balanced budget every year. So, regardless of what our hopes are, we will have to match it up. And so I think what this process is allowing us to do is really understand what are those programmatic needs. We may not be able to do them all in 1 year, but it at least starts to get us on a path of understanding it and determining, is this a reallocation need or is this a new revenue need? And it helps us plan and do that work. But regardless, we'll still have to balance the budget at the end of the year. And so that, which is kind of a relief, and it's also a big challenge.
I mean,
okay. And then, I'm sorry.
I know I won't say anything more. I mean, that's, we have to balance it. So there's not infinite resources, but we try to you got to recognize that the departments have been through a lot. They've lived through the Great Recession. They lived through COVID. There's so many events that take place where we do have to reduce the budget. And yet, whether you're using PBB or any other tool, still in front of you is, what else can we do? And that's the hope and optimism of the process, is you still have a lot of levers potentially to pull.
Okay, and then my last question is, how in this process, how does it work to sort of think about or reflect items that are not sort of currently like developed? So I'm thinking about kind of climate stuff in particular. Like if we looked at, you know, sort of what we have in there right now, it would be relatively small compared to what some of us might want it to look like. And I know that that's part of it, right, is looking at sort of each of the thing, but I'm thinking if maybe sort of in places where the gap between like what it is and how it might show up and kind of the dream of what it could be or what we want it to be is really big. Like how do we make sure that it's kind of, it is showing up and getting in there in the right way?
Great question. So the first analysis is kind of like current state. Here's what you're providing now. Here's what it costs. Here's how they relate to outcomes. And here's your prioritization. When you work from that current state to the actual budget process, that's where you're going to get into, I believe, where you're thinking of going, which is, what if I want to start a new program, or I want to triple the size of a current program that we offer right now? With the rest of the PBB data, at least you'll be able to know, is that program worth tripling? Or is it low priority? It really doesn't have anything to do with the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And so we don't want that to be a budget request that we entertain. So the PBB data provides some context to say, should we grow it? Should we make it the size of the program that you want? And then the rest of the budget process flows. How are we going to get the resources reallocated in order to fund that?
Thank you. Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, thanks. So it'll be my 26th budget, and all but a handful of them were cut budgets. So it'll be interesting to see how this works. I feel like this is kind of back to the future, where we were going back to service-based budgets, with the added wrinkle of reallocating resources towards council priorities. So I'm eager to see how that actually works and how we're going to get there. And depending on how it works and what the outcomes are, I might end up liking this.
Thank you. Eliza.
So I have so many questions and so many thoughts that, in the spirit of prioritization, I'm going to take some time to absorb and ponder and prioritize, and only ask two right now. So for the first question I have is that I'm assuming that we're going to talk about this more at future dates. If I have questions or thoughts that come up between now and April, end of April, is there a person on staff who I should direct those to?
Yeah, I think Abby Alway, who's here and has her camera on, is our project manager. So you can start with her, and she can figure out where to send it if it's something she can't answer. Does that work for you, Abby? She's like, thanks.
Yep, no, it's perfect. And my email just follows same format, Alway.
Okay, I'll try and send you one big email as opposed to like a million little tiny emails over the course of the next.
I'll figure it out either way.
Yeah. And then the other question I had is, for those of us who really enjoy looking at long columns of numbers, will we still be able to do that?
Yeah, the line items don't go away. Okay. They just are organized around programs and services, but you can still see line items. If you love it, the good old fashioned way, all line items, that you will still have all of those.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you. Next in the queue is Councillor Keating, who forwarded a message to me to a question that I will ask Chris on his behalf. Sure. You mentioned creative revenue generation ideas in Littleton in particular. Here in Oregon, by and large, we're a property tax state and income tax state. However, we do have a sales tax on cannabis, liquor, and gasoline. So while a broad sales tax isn't necessarily palatable, there are sin tax or luxury items Oregon voters recognize having a value in taxing appropriately. In your experience in both Colorado and beyond, what creative revenue generating items are worth highlighting or exploring here in Eugene?
And I do know some of the restrictions that you have in Oregon. We work with Salem, we work with City of Tualatin as well, Klamath Falls. So definitely appreciate you have some specific restrictions. Beyond just your normal fees and taxes, where we have seen some really creative ideas really happen by way of partnerships. So you're a larger community overall, and it might be the case that you have the opportunity to provide services at scale where other communities would gladly buy in, so to speak, from a partnership perspective overall, if there was a regional solution. For a larger community like yourselves, you also have the university that's there. And as you start to develop your program inventory and answer the question, does everybody rely on you to provide a particular program overall? That's where we're going to really start to explore the entrepreneurial side of this, which is, hey, for instance, in Denver, they provide janitorial services throughout the entire city, all city facilities, parks, and those facilities externally. And then you start to think about a lot of the smaller suburb communities, certainly during the worst of the pandemic, where they're barely hanging on to their entire service portfolio. Numerous communities were glad to pay into a larger city to receive the benefit of a particular program in a way that's not just cost neutral, but actually provides a win-win for the smaller community, paying less to a larger community overall, and to a larger community who can actually use those resources as they see fit. That being one example with a lot of promise.
Thank you. Next is Siobhan, followed by Councillor Semple.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I too have quite a few questions. Catherine covered my one about like how we're going to gauge this, because I think that's going to be a huge part in where we can prioritize. I do have, since you just mentioned partnering, how do we, so would our partners then also be held to that same department assessment and then the peer review? Is that how you guys have done it before?
Let me make sure I'm going to repeat back to you. Are you wondering if you partnered with another entity, do they need to also have done priority-based budgeting in order to come up with a partnership?
Or fit into that criteria of where there would be a self-assessment done by the department and then a peer review that I guess we do?
And sorry for asking another clarifying question. I'm almost there probably. Are you curious if you currently are paying, like you have money going out the door to a contractor, whether that's public sector, nonprofit, doesn't matter. Are you curious if they're going to do scoring? Is that your question?
It's very, very close. I mean, I guess, would it be the same scale is more what I'm asking. So
I think the answer is, yeah, I think the answer is no. They wouldn't be going through that. We wouldn't be requiring our partners to go through any of that process. We would have gone through it. We would have identified there's somebody in the community that can do that, and we would be seeking that out as a contract or some sort of partnership.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That was kind of what I was asking, and I can send all my follow-up questions to Abby.
Awesome.
Thank you, Councillor Semple, followed by Councillor Groves.
Wow, this is really different. I think there's an awful lot of potential here. It's pretty alien feeling too, so I kind of like that. It'll be really interesting to see where it goes. It sounds like a very time-consuming process. And that doesn't, it's, you know, just observational, but time and money, we need to make sure they're very well spent. And this seems like something you could play with for a long time, and maybe to get to some place really great, but we might not have the resources for that. So I'm going to be interested to see how you really put it into effect. You know, who really comes and talks and puts this input in before it comes to us. I think it's got a lot of potential. It's really interesting, and it's going to take a lot of focus and dedication that I hope doesn't take away from something else we need. So, thank you.
I would only say you're right. It's not just like plug and play. Creating the data is going to be very powerful. And the way that you set yourself up for the decisions that you want to make will depend on the quality of the data that we create. So we're spending a lot of time in the setup phase, so to speak. And then other good news, you know, Mauricio talked about one-time things. The initial data creation can be thought of as more one-time in nature. There's a lot of effort in the beginning to create that program inventory, do that first mapping of costs, and it will never be as time-consuming again in the future years.
Well,
you better and better.
Learn to speak a new language. I think it supposedly gets easier. I don't do that. I think this has the potential to make some really big changes in how we view ourselves as a city and what we want to accomplish. That might not come out if we were only making line items. Not that we don't love line items, but the bigger picture look and from a different viewpoint, I think this is going to be fascinating. I think it's really timely. I think we're all struggling a little bit for identity, having been separated and the world changing so fast that we know we can't do it the way we did it before, but what's the next way? And I think this will help us find it. It works.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Groves and then Ryan Kanofsky.
Thank you, Chair. I too have seen a lot of budgets over the years through Eugene. I was a staff person for a lot of years and an executive manager for 10 years, and then a budget committee member, now a counselor, and seen a lot of different flavors of budgeting. Some worked, some did not. I'm intrigued by this. I'm never afraid to try something new, but I need to play with it a little bit before I'm really able to form a good opinion. But like I said, I'm for anything that tries to get us to think of things differently and come at from a new direction. So I look forward to digging in on that end. Thank you.
Ryan, followed by Councilor Yang.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really, really intriguing. I think this has a lot of potential, but I think this is going from probably driving, riding a bicycle to driving a, Tesla. It's going to be a big, different whole vehicle that, we're all going to have to get used to driving. It's going to be a little bit complicated. I too have many questions. Abby, I'll be sending them your way. But I think one I really had that I was curious about is timelines for a typical process. How long does something like this take to do? Beginning of your whole process, right? Budget, or not overall process, but yearly budget. Like when they start their program evaluation to timeline. How what does it typically take to do that level of analysis?
Abby, I don't know if this is a good opportunity for you to share some of your process in timeline, and I can certainly reflect that our communities take it at the appropriate timeline for their organization. In Pittsburgh, they needed this in 3 months, including November and December holidays. So we got it done all of it in 3 months. And in other organizations, they take their time over a longer period of time. Fort Collins has a 2-year budget, not to talk about 2-year budget, but they spread it out over that period of time. So we know, what I can tell you is even in the Pittsburgh 3-month timeline, minus the holidays, so which makes it like a 2-month timeline or less, that was a lot of work on staff, and they were probably spending for department heads close to 5 hours per week in that really condensed period of time. For if you imagine it's spread out over a longer period of time, then it's less than 5 hours a week. But Abby, I didn't know if that was helpful or as a segue.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a slide that has kind of our draft timeline on it, if that would be helpful. Okay. Okay, so this is still draft because as Sarah and Chris have both mentioned, we have a stable rhythm, but we are building in some flexibility in how we are going to accomplish some of our tasks. But we wanted to overlay a little bit of this priority-based budgeting process with our building budget process. And so where you can kind of see us right now, we're just wrapping up at what we'd call our planning phase. And that was just a lot of building our teams, getting our project teams together, communicating high level view of what priority-based budgeting entails to all the stakeholders in the organization. So really next week, we kind of move into our next phase, which is that program inventory phase. So that's where our staff teams kind of really get into the weeds with inputting all of the programs. So really just creating an inventory of every service and program that we either offer to the community or that we need to run the organization. And that overall process is about a month that we've allotted for program inventory. And we have a big team that's working on it, and we've kind of divided up by division so that no one person is responsible for a massive amount of work. We've got sort of the knowledge experts, people who are really knowledgeable about what their programs are in their divisions, working on building their program inventories. And then by mid-April, we're going to kind of be moving into our program costing allocation phase. So that's assigning those line items. So then we have an opportunity this summer where we can make some of those assessments that Chris mentioned. There's those basic program assessments that we can first start with, which is like, is it mandated? What populations are served? That kind of stuff. And then we do have some opportunity. We may not get to it this year, but most likely in future PBB work, we'll be able to build in some more of the attributes that we'll assess against that are more city council driven and community driven. We're working with a consultant, we plan to work with another consultant to help us do some strategic planning. That's just in the scheduling phase right now. So you could see those blue arrows. We are working with them to see if we can get them plugged in this spring or if it'll be more in the fall and September. And then our community engagement piece, we are going to be looking at doing that this summer. We wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to engage the community early on, and we didn't want to wait a whole year because what we realized is summer is a tricky time to engage with anybody, but we figure what we could do is launch the summer a kind of community engagement light so that we really do get to test the waters and start talking with people a little bit, knowing full well that we will follow up with a more robust engagement plan in a year from now. And really this timeline has us working towards having the ability to be able to make some more data-driven decisions with that extra layer of data that Chris talked about by the time we start building our budget in the fall.
Cool. I don't know if that's back to me, Ty, or.
Did that answer your question about the timeline?
I think so, yeah. I think I was just more hoping for like a typical, once we get past implementation, right? How are we looking at, we're planning now for 3 years away, things like that. But it looks like, probably about a 5-month timeline turnaround is what we're thinking typically.
Yeah, for this implementation phase.
Okay.
Because this is, like I said, this is the bulk of the work that's happening now to implement this, to start to build the culture of priority-based budgeting at the city. As we build those muscles, it'll be different work as we go through. It might be assessing programs in a different way. It might be, as I think Chris, you mentioned insights, right? That's sort of taking a look at some specific programs and seeing where opportunities are. that might be some future work. We don't need to do program inventory again or cost allocation again in the same way.
Thank you, Councilor Ye, followed by Raina Jackson.
Thanks, Chair. I don't have any questions at this time.
Thank you, Raina, followed by Councilor Syret.
My one question had to do with the slide that was shared about Washington County, and on there it said 2016 to 2020. And again, that's where there was that increase of 11.5 million. So it might go back to kind of what Ryan may have been trying to get at, is when those actual budget savings are starting to be seen. Is that like it's implemented and then it takes 4 years to really see that big, like 12%, reallocation in the budget? Or is it really more immediate where you're seeing it like that and then you are kind of implementing it? Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
Okay.
So it depends on what you need, is the reality of it. So in Washington County, it has been drawn out over multiple years. It took them a while to get to that level of resource reallocation. And that's more typical. If you can imagine your first year, you're kind of learning the ropes. Abby used you're building the muscle. So you're getting a good program inventory and your costs, and you're really starting to think through, where might I have opportunities to reallocate, or what program would I like to do less of if I could do more of something else? And you can kind of take that toe in the water approach, so long as you can afford to. I think I would match it up with Maurizio's presentation about your fiscal reality. And as you start to think through, wow, how are we going to make sure that we stay where we want to be for our bond ratings, for our reserve policy, that will drive how fast you need to start to reallocate resources at a higher degree. In Pittsburgh's case, they felt like they can't wait any longer on their climate action goals. And so they didn't take the time necessarily to build the muscle. They needed to jump right in. That's not every organization. That's their priority. And so I think that's that will drive your speed, is your own needs overall, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And Councilor Syret.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. I don't have questions. I just have some comments. I agree with a lot of what Councilor Semple said. I think this process has real potential to help kind of lift up our vision from the minutia to look at how is our budget reflecting community priorities as recognized by City Council, and looking at our programs to ensure that they are what we need, they are what we want, help us to have a framework for revising them if need be, or adding new ones that we might identify as needed to meet the goals we've set. Our current budget process is very time consuming of staff, and it's every year. So I think, given the potential benefits of this new process, the time investment up front, I think will pay off. And if we think about the things we've grappled with in this last couple of years and new things that we've got on our plate, racial justice, police reform, homelessness, climate change, we've now are going to have a work session on what does a public health overlay zone look like. So that's going to be, some new conversations that may then link to need to fund something. So I'm excited and look forward to continuing to hear from the city manager and staff on this.
Thank you. I have a question for the city manager. Can you sing me a verse from the Revenue Rapper remix, please?
No, but I have acronyms memorized.
Okay, we'll save that for a later meeting. On the budgeting, I'm I think, about the same place of where I've heard Councilor Semple and Syret, along with also what Councilors Groves and Zelenka said, which is that This seems promising. I'm eager to see it in action. I'm not quite sure what it will look like until we really see it. It does seem like it's going to be a lot of work. Seems like it could be worthwhile. At the conceptual level, it seems like a really good way to approach budgeting. So I love the idea, but the devil is in the details. So I'm going to be waiting to see what it really looks like in practice. But I'm hopeful. It looks promising to me. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
With that, I think we can move out of that agenda item. Oh, I have a hand from Councilor Semple.
Thank you. How much is this costing us? And how long, have we hired you for?
Our contract is $65,000 for our services and the software, which if we get even close to what resource reallocation opportunities are, we hope to develop the ROI will hopefully be much beyond 65,000. And we're here through the entire implementation. And then the city always has an option. You're not on the hook. We have approximate 90% resubscription rate with our clients as they move from one year to the next. But you're also free to take what you learn and build upon it on your own and consider it a one-time cost as well.
So what's the implementation period?
Exactly how Abby outlined it in her calendar.
Well, you're getting 65,000. I know you're not going to do that forever. So are we looking at 6 weeks, 6 years?
I'm sorry.
It's 12 months.
Yeah. Sorry about that. That's exactly right. So
yes, it's 12 months. It's 12 months. Yeah, for the implementation period. Yep.
And since we're talking budget, come on, how much do you cost?
There you go.
Are you worth it?
Hey, priority-based budgeting gets scored as a program. So you think about the time that goes in, that has to still be in alignment with your priorities as well. If it's low priority, you should question your investment by our own philosophy.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move to our next item, which is minutes approval. Minutes from the December 8th meeting were sent out. Did anyone have any recommended changes or any comments they wanted to make on those minutes? Or I'm sorry, did Mayor Vinnis, did you have anything you wanted to say on this topic before we move on?
Oh, no, I was just waving goodbye to Chris.
Oh, okay. So I saw the hand out of the corner of my eye.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Chris. Thank you. So minutes, did anyone have any changes or comments? And if not, would anyone? Oh, we do have one. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Surprise. I had a question. I was just looking through and I noticed that under the end of the minutes approval from the last one, there was sort of the request from Ryan around kind of including some more detail about what the conversations were in the deliberation. And so I was just curious if there has been any further kind of conversation about what that might look like.
Are you referring specific to the email that you sent me earlier today, correct?
No, this was just in the minutes for the last meeting, under the minutes approval section, there was a comment related to Ryan Moore had asked kind of whether there could be more detailed information about sort of the content of the deliberations in the meetings. And it said will be discussed and responded to in the future. So I just wasn't sure if there was any more information about whether anything is going to change on that piece.
Yeah, I haven't had any conversations with staff about that, so I don't know whether Vicky and Twyla picked that up after the meeting, but we can certainly follow up on that. You know, we do the best we can to give as much, you know, content as we can, and then also point people to the videos so they can watch in full detail.
Thank you. Does anyone have any further changes or comments? And if not, does anyone want to make a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Moved by Councilor Siret, seconded by Councilor Zelenka. All in favor? I'm seeing 11 hands, which I believe is the number of people currently able to actively participate on camera in the meeting at this time. So I believe that means the minutes are approved unanimously. That brings us to the next agenda item, which is election of officers. So I see Councilor Siret's hand.
I move to appoint Ty Cruz Zimmerman as chair.
Second. I heard Raina second that fastest. But it was a close race. Is there any discussion on that motion? All in favor? I see once again 11 hands. So I believe that is unanimous once again. Thank you very much. I am honored to serve for another year. Do I have any nominations for vice chair?
I don't know.
Oh no. Sorry, I'm having Zoom issues, but I can hear you guys because I'm on the phone. I was gonna nominate Eliza for vice chair.
I'll second it since that's what I was going to do.
Motion from Catherine, seconded from Councilor Semple. Do we have any discussion on making Eliza our vice chair again? Hearing none, all in favor? And including Catherine's vote in the chat, I see once again 11 in favor. Once again, it is unanimous. So that makes chair and vice chair the same as it was when the meeting began. Thank you very much, everyone. So that just brings us to wrap up, and then which is that we've got our next meeting coming up in April, where we'll have the budget presentation followed by our 3 meetings in May to deliberate. My understanding from staff at this time is that the intent is to hold that April meeting in person if possible, but logistics are being currently worked out. There's some things that haven't quite been figured out yet about how to properly allow public participation, how to handle hybrid meeting necessities. So if all of that is figured out, that may be an in-person meeting, but there aren't any guarantees at this time. And we'll find out when staff's able to notify us of that. And other than that, I look forward to seeing you one way or another in April. Until then, this meeting is adjourned at 7:41 p.m.